Welcome back to Scaling Theory. My guest today is Cass Sunstein, university professor at Harvard University and one of the most influential legal and political thinkers of our time. A prolific author of dozens of books and hundreds of academic articles, Cass has shaped debates in constitutional law, administrative law, behavioral economics, and public policy. He is regularly ranked amongst the very top of the most cited legal scholars alive. Cass also served as administrator of the White House Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs under President Obama. He has advised governments and international organizations around the world and was awarded the Holberg Prize, the equivalent of a Nobel in law and the humanities. His latest book, called On Liberalism in Defense of Freedom, is a systematic defense of the liberal tradition at a moment when it is, as he shows, under unprecedented pressure. Our conversation is centered around the book. We begin with the urgency at the heart of the book, how liberalism confronts critiques from moral conservatives and egalitarian progressives alike, what it means to defend the liberal framework in an era of fragmentation, etc. We then turn to questions of scaling. Does liberalism have internal patterns or institutional mechanisms that allow it to scale across diverse societies? We grapple with how the liberal tradition of thinkers, from Mill and Hayek to Roosevelt's Second Bill of Rights, impacts liberalism's ability to scale. We also explore how liberalism navigates technological change, expertise versus public accountability, and the pretence of knowledge. I hope you enjoy our conversation. So thank you so very much for coming on the podcast. We've been exchanging emails for quite some time, and I've been following your work for even longer. So it's a real privilege for me to have you here. Also, as I just told you, I just spent a week with the book and developed a real relationship with it. So it feels like the end of a small cycle or a lovely relationship having this conversation with you. What you do from the get-go is that you defined liberalism, and I think you do it very clearly. You say that liberals believe six different things: freedom, human rights, pluralism, security, the rule of law, and democracy. And so, of course, I'd like to keep those 6 commitments in the background of our conversation, because a lot of my questions will be about how do we scale all of them or some of those elements. Now, you write that more than at any time since World War II, liberalism is under pressure and even under siege. Pronounce it the French way since it's a French word. You explain that from both the right, blaming it for family collapse and moral decay, to the left, calling it exhausted and unable to handle corporate power and inequality, liberalism faces attacks. And so there is a real sense of urgency while reading the book. As we will see toward the end of our conversation, you do end on a positive note. So I want to reassure everyone right now that if you stay with us, you'll probably feel energized after the conversation. And something else that I wanted to mention before asking the first question is that you write in the introduction, I quote you here, "I love Hayek, but I love Mill more." And for me, it's probably the exact opposite. I love Mill, but I love Hayek even more. And I trust that this is precisely what will make this conversation interesting. With this in mind, first, I want to talk about the urgency and what it means in 2026, what we should do. And then I'll talk about how do we scale it, which is probably more medium to long term. Starting with the first question before all things, you dedicate the book to the anti-liberals everywhere. I thought this was provocative. I loved it. Is that an invitation to conversation? Is that a challenge, or is it something else?
A bit of both. So anti-liberals are human beings and worthy of respect and engagement. Some of them have some very powerful points. even more of them have very powerful minds. And I would like to engage them on liberalism. And I'm hopeful that anti-liberals will, in the fullness of time, become liberals, thinking that their own deepest commitments are compatible with liberal commitments.
Yeah. You do mention some of the arguments that they put out indeed, and acknowledge that sometimes some of them may be at least partially convincing, so we'll come back to it. But something you argue is that liberals, they tend to see tribalism as an obstacle to mutual respect and productive forms of interaction, and that liberals are deeply uncomfortable with categorizing people as X versus Y, which is why they are generally skeptical of what Americans will call identity politics. Now, this was very interesting to me. I like that a lot because it reminds me of French universalism, which, being French and liberal and a universalist, I believe we very much need. My question is, would you describe yourself as a French universalist? And by that, I mean rejecting categorizing people and putting them into boxes. Like, by the way, some French people have done, unfortunately, like Foucault and Derrida and others.
I would, though I'm alert to the irony that if one says one is a French universalist, one is engaging in a form of identity ascription, at least. But I take the point, and I agree that for someone to say, I'm a white male and therefore, or I'm a black woman and therefore, or I'm a Muslim and therefore, this has a place, of course, and people may know something by virtue of their background and experience that it's important for others to hear. Still, the liberal commitment is to the dignity of persons and the universality of that, and to insist that discussion is fundamentally rooted in something like identity is dangerous, I think, and illiberal and not productive, because fundamentally the commonality of persons is, let's just say, a good path forward.
Yeah. And I mean, to some extent, even describing yourself as a liberal is also categorizing within society as being part of that group. But I would see a difference between saying I'm a liberal and anyone can be, as opposed to saying I'm French and not everyone can be, or at least it's more complicated, right? So would you make a distinction between those different kind of categories?
Yeah, so I'm a liberal. I'm also an enthusiast about dogs. I really love playing both squash and tennis. I'm an English speaker, it appears. I hope I'm doing okay with English. I've lost some hair, so I'm a little bit, maybe more than a little bit bald. I'm not nearsighted. And, each of us has a very large number of characteristics which we could connect with ourself, and that wouldn't be unfair. But to use it as distinguished from other persons, that's what's potentially a source of illiberalism and conceivably a lack of mutual understanding and enmity in the worst cases. So, there's a Johnny Cash song, I've Been Everywhere Man, and he talks about being in various places in the United States. As we talk, I think that not long ago, I've been to multiple nations that are very different from mine, and there wasn't a single one where I felt a lack of commonality.
Yeah. I mean, that's a reference to music. We won't talk about it, but in one of the last chapters, it's also all about music. And I enjoyed that one very much. So just putting that out there.
Thank you.
Something we have to talk about, you mentioned tennis. It's a bit outside of the subject, but are you in the Federer clan or Rafael Nadal?
I like them both. So this may be a character flaw or just a liberal characteristic I have. I love them both. I guess I love Nadal a little bit better because his humanity is more visible as he suffers and hugs. But who doesn't love Federer? He's incredible.
All right, this was indeed a trick question. Okay, back to more serious topics. So at one point, you write that liberals do not fear change. This is a quote from the book. When I read that, I couldn't help thinking about Huxley, Brave New World, and his critique of what he calls the world controllers. So those are the people, if you haven't read the book, by the way, you should.
Yes.
Not for you, but the people out there. Those figures that oppose change precisely because they have built an order that actually benefits them while claiming it benefits everyone. And what strikes me is that when I see people in the US describe themselves as liberal in the sense of US politics, it seems that very often they are deeply afraid of change and especially technological change. We see that, for instance, when it comes to AI. So, how would you interpret this tension between liberalism and what we now call liberalism in US politics?
There's a great kind of polemicist of conservatism in the English language named William F. Buckley Jr. I describe him as a polemicist. He's not really a theorist, though he's a superb writer and a very quick thinker. He was. And in one of his great writings, he said that conservatives stand athwart history yelling, stop. And that suggests what is, I think, fundamental to an illiberal viewpoint of a certain right of center sort, which is that change is to be feared and that innovation is worrisome. Burke talked about innovation with alarm. I love Burke, and think Burke was at times liberal, but there's something not very liberal about how he speaks about prejudice with enthusiasm and innovation with concern. So the liberal thought is we whisper to history, go. We don't stand athwart it yelling, stop. Liberals, though of course it's true that some changes are legitimately a source of concern. If you're moving to an area of the world that's very dangerous, if you've lost your job, you might be fearful. If you get a cancer diagnosis, that's a change that scares you. There's a precautionary principle, which is popular in Europe and some places in North America, which is kind of anti-change idea. As you talk about technology, I'm thinking there are some on the left who embrace the precautionary principle. I don't like the precautionary principle very much. I think it tends to swallow itself because precautions give rise to risk of harm and danger. So the very things that the precautionary principle mandates, the precautionary principle forbids. Nonetheless, you've got the temper of some people on the left who are frightened of nuclear power, of artificial intelligence, of greenhouse gases. Whether those fears are justified depends on what the evidence suggests. I think it does justify the fear in the context of climate change. So that's a form of change that it's reasonable to fear. The point about liberalism generally is that innovation in thinking, innovation in science, innovation in the workplace, innovation in universities, innovation in governments, liberals' ears are wide open. They're thinking, what's the reason for that? With a degree often of optimism and hope.
You are generally in favor of cost benefit analysis. And that is indeed one way to be a liberal, in which you would say, okay, I would not accept that any change is good because it's new. However, I'm willing to consider evidence, pros and cons, and try to balance it out. Can you talk a bit about that? Why do you think this is indeed a good way to approach those issues?
So suppose the question is whether to regulate air pollution to a certain degree, or whether the question is whether to require certain technology on cars so that people don't get hurt in crashes or so they don't crash. Regulation of air pollution frequently costs something. It might cost really a lot. The same is true of safety requirements on automobiles. To increase the cost of energy is no light thing. That's harmful to people. To increase the cost of automobiles might make it very hard for people who don't have a lot of money to buy cars. That's not a very good thing. It also might have knock-on economic effects that are bad. On the other hand, if you make cars safer, maybe people won't get hurt or die. And if you make the air cleaner, maybe the level of illness and death will go down, and that's good. So the only way to make a judgment is to think, what are the magnitude of the effects, positive and negative? And now you're in cost benefit analysis. I was in the White House under President Obama, and the cost benefit analysis was the foundation for regulatory policy. President Obama very enthusiastically endorsed it. And I see it, and many liberals also see it, as a way of ensuring an insistent focus on the human consequences of what government's doing. To do something because, let's say, it's going to make the air cleaner, that's not adequate. What else is it going to do? Not to do something because it's going to raise the price of goods is not adequate. Maybe it's going to raise the price of goods and do an assortment of really amazingly impressive things. And so cost benefit analysis tries to discipline all that.
If I again ask a follow up question, so of course we hear that from people opposing cost benefits analysis that it is hard to put everything in equation or to really balance it out. So this will be one of the big limits of conducting this kind of analysis. Is that the best argument against? And how would you answer it? Why do you think that it is still worth engaging in cost benefits analysis?
It can be hard, but it's not always hard. So if we're making, let's say, refrigerators more energy efficient, it might not be so hard to figure out how much more is our appliances going to cost if they're more energy efficient. And it might not be so hard to figure out what are you going to get from that increase in energy efficiency. How much are you going to decrease operating costs for consumers, and what kind of environmental effects are you going to have? I worked for 4 years in the US government, and cost benefit analysis was what I worked on every day. And you can certainly monetize the costs and benefits of a whole assortment of things. Now, some things it's hard to monetize. You might not have the data. You might be making workplaces safer. You know that, but how much safer, you don't know. It might be something where the science is indeterminate, but then you'll probably have a range. You're not going to save 200 million people, and you're not going to save two. Now, if all you have is between 2 and 200 million, you don't know very much, but it will be staggeringly surprising. If that's the range would be more like a lower bound of 600 and an upper bound of 2000. That would be more standard. And now we know enough to actually start thinking about how the cost benefit analysis works. It might be the anticipated costs are lower, higher than the projected costs, but there are ways of figuring that out, meaning there are ways of figuring out which way the error is likely to go and then having an appropriate adjustment. It might be that you know the health effects, but to translate the health effects into monetary equivalence is hard, but there are standard ways to do that. So we know that if you're eliminating a risk of 1 in 100,000, let's say, to value that as €1 million would be pretty wild. To value that at zero would also be pretty wild. And then we have a lot of data on appropriate valuation. So there are cases where it's really hard to do cost benefit analysis. That's true. Like if you're eliminating prison rape, the valuation of eliminating 100 prison rapes that's both uncomfortable and extremely difficult. But you wouldn't devote all of GDP to the elimination of 100 prison rapes. And you wouldn't devote, just a tiny, tiny amount to that unless you're heartless. And so you're going to have an implicit assignment if you decide to go forward or not. And to get transparent about it and make the best judgment you can based on what you've got, that's what good governments are doing right now, even if some of the cases are very challenging.
Yeah, I was about to say, this is why we elect officials so that they can make those decisions, which are uncomfortable. Maybe a reason why some people don't want to engage in cost benefits analysis, but still, it may be a good way to reach decision when you have indeed pluralism in opinions and different ideas. And to come back to Hayek, as you do cover in the book, you could also use price mechanism. Of course, it's not perfect, but as Hayek called it, this is a marvel because it will encapsulate a lot of the knowledge out there in the society. To conclude part one of the discussion, and before we move on to the more long-term objective of liberalism, could you explain why you are hopeful about our ability to overcome the challenges? And I mean, I guess it will come to no surprise to any of the listeners that liberalism is under attack indeed. So why do you think it will actually make it?
Well, I'll give two answers. The first involves character, meaning the nature of at least some of us, which is reflected in the words of a great behavioral scientist, Amos Tversky, who said, "I'm an optimist, and the reason I'm an optimist is that it's rational to be an optimist. If you're a pessimist, you suffer twice." And that's basically the character many of us have, for better or for worse. We don't want to suffer twice. The other reason, if you look at the arc of history, the liberal commitment to, let's say, the rule of law, pluralism, freedom from fear, freedom broadly, form of security, form of self-government has proved remarkably robust. There are things we can say that are qualifications of those things. Democracy isn't exactly on fire these days in the world. But the fundamental commitments continue to be extremely strong, even in nations that wouldn't describe themselves as liberal, not all of them, but in many of them. The idea that the rule of law is really important, that freedom of a certain sort is very important. This is built into the fabric of at least many of the citizens of the world's nations, and it connects with fundamental parts of human nature. So in the long run, the liberal commitments are highly likely to survive.
Yeah, okay, I'm also an optimist, so I will take your word for granted and leave it at that. Let's move on now to the more long-term objective, which might be, and we'll discuss whether or not this is a universal objective, to scale liberalism. And the first question is whether you have identified while writing the book, and I know you started doing research on it actually a couple of years back, some must-haves, some patterns or rules that will explain why liberalism scales in society. Or do you think maybe on the contrary, it's chaotic, it's a process that is driven by too many elements that we cannot anticipate?
This is a great question. So in general, social practices are often subject to factors that are not implausibly summarized by the word random. So if you look at the success of Taylor Swift, if you look at the success of Barack Obama, if you look at the success of Donald Trump, if you look at the success of nations, there are a lot of factors that contributed to those things which don't make it into the history books and could have gone the other way. So we often think with the benefit of hindsight that it was inevitable that, and that's pleasing, and the human mind feels a kind of click when that's said, because there's a causal story of why it happened, which is not untruthful to the facts. But the claim of inevitability is not correct, that something could have gone the other way, such that, and then take your pick. Now, with respect to macro forces as well as significant micro ones, because history is only run once, it's hard to prove what I just said is true. There are randomized controlled trials of smaller things that show that cultural success, for example, is a product of things that could have gone the other way easily. We know this is true with respect to books and music. You referred to music. With respect to liberalism, it's hard to be clear on the large forces and how they led to liberal success or the scaling of liberalism. I'm speaking right now from Concord, Massachusetts, which is serendipitously the origin of the American Revolution, which was emphatically a liberal revolution. It was attacking illiberalism in multiple forms. How did that come to work out? We can tell stories that are pleasing, and but I don't know that they're true. I'd like to say that liberalism's scaling in Europe, in France, where liberalism, by the way, originated. Liberalism as such is a French creation more than any country. Is that inevitable? Is there something in the French culture that made France the parent of liberalism, or could it have happened in Germany or the United Kingdom? I tend to think it could have happened in Germany or the United Kingdom. So the scaling is there are multiple success stories. There are reasons why liberalism and economic growth are associated. There are reasons why liberalism and human well-being are associated. Liberalism does scale. That's emphatically the case. But why exactly, what the mechanisms are, could they go the other way? This is something which I don't think we have a very good handle on.
It's funny because when you tell people that liberalism originated from France, most people will be shocked. Now, something you mentioned in the book is that Roosevelt's Second Bill of Rights had extraordinary influence internationally and played a major role in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And in fact, in his speech from 1941, he identified 4 fundamental freedoms: 1, freedom of speech; 2, freedom of religion; 3, freedom from want; and 4, freedom from fear. Now, what strikes me is that Roosevelt explicitly presents this freedom as something that should exist everywhere in the world. And this is a citation from him. Do you share his view that liberalism, properly understood, is meant to be universal? Or would you actually argue that it's maybe not something that should scale globally?
Torn on this. One reason I'm torn is humility about what one's own commitments entail and whether every nation in the world should respect those commitments. There are 190 plus nations in the world. The idea every single one should be liberal sounds imperialistic. That's on one side. On the other side, the notion that everyone in the world deserves to be treated with dignity. I think that no one should be ashamed to assert that being treated with dignity entails certain things, specific things, like, let's say, no torture, no imprisonment without some kind of fair process. That's associated with freedom from fear, by the way, and something which Americans maybe have not highlighted as much in their own minds over the last 10 years. It's being highlighted a bit more now. Those things I think are properly universal. The idea that people have freedom of speech universally, I'd want to be hesitant before abandoning that claim. Of course, what freedom of speech specifically entails reasonably can be taken to differ from one place to another. The notion that people should have freedom from want, I think we have to say, as the South African Constitution does, consistent with available resources. But to see that as a moral commitment without necessarily seeing it as a feasible, enforceable commitment in every nation in the world, that seems pretty sensible and connected with the notion that everyone deserves dignity. So I'm kind of convincing myself as we talk to embrace some form of Roosevelt's imperialism.
I ask the question because it seems that some liberal would argue for one and some would argue for the other. I'm reminded of Nozick, the philosopher actually from Harvard University, who in one of his books actually wrote that as long as it's a choice of the people, if they want to live under some sort of autocracy or another system that is not a democracy, they should be free to do that. So it seems that there is a tension indeed amongst thinkers as to whether it should scale globally or not. But let's just assume that we want it to scale, whether globally or at least, in specific regions. I do wonder whether the fact that it is a big tent, as you put it, with internal disagreement, can actually hurt its ability to scale. So as you do mention in the book, Nozick thinks redistribution is fundamentally unjust, whilst Rawls think it is mandatory. So do you think that the big tent of liberalism is a strength because it would actually enable discussion and will build like a better form, more effective form of it? Or is it something that dilutes its coherence in a sense?
Liberalism has a holy trinity. I'd single out the rule of law, pluralism, and freedom as the holy trinity of liberal commitments. So Hayek was committed emphatically to those three things. Rawls too. Hayek and Rawls are in some ways in fundamentally different camps, certainly with respect to redistribution and certainly with their basic concerns. There are many people who aren't committed to the rule of law, who don't like it. There are practices that are inconsistent with the rule of law all over the world. Pluralism is not widely embraced in some places. I think in the world it's frequently embraced, but not universally embraced. Let's put it that way. And freedom, of course, is a contentious notion. Liberals give it pride of place. Illiberals don't. And you can take history as villains or people who are less broadly agreed to be villains who think of freedom in ways that liberals don't like. Favor the Holy Trinity and are liberal in that sense. You have a fighting faith, not a watered down thing. So you are contesting practices all over the world, including in liberal societies. So there are liberal societies in which freedom and the rule of law and pluralism are under occasional or more than occasional pressure. To insist on those liberal commitments is not to insist on something like air, which everybody I think likes air, but to insist on something that is like a knife that cuts against practices and also against theoretical positions. Carl Schmitt, the German theorist who was a Nazi and a defender of anti-liberal, illiberal, post-liberal thinking. Carl Schmitt, who's very intelligent in many ways, is not my favorite, and he's having a moment. So there are many Schmittians in English-speaking countries. I'm reading a lot of Schmitt these days, and I'm not liking what I'm reading. To say Schmitt is wrong, and here are the reasons, is to say something that's edgy now, not platitudinous.
I definitely want to end on a positive note. So at some point, we're going to have to counter that with some more positive news than that one. But for now, I want to talk about technology. And you note in the book that, and I quote you here, in some times and places, liberalism has leaned technocratic with an emphasis on the importance of experts and expertise. In some other times and places, liberalism has leaned populist with an emphasis on the need for accountability and public control. How should liberals navigate this tension today, let's say, when it comes to AI?
Okay, so the most glorious moments of liberalism are populist moments, not technocratic moments. But many of the most constructive moments of liberalism are technocratic, not populist moments. So I'm thinking that, to combat health risks or safety risks often involves a populist push and then a technocratic initiative in which we're thinking, for example, how do we prevent deaths on the highways? Hooray for Sweden, which has been highly technocratic and effective in reducing deaths on the highways. With AI, technocratic deserves a kind of centrality. So one question is, what are the risks to a system of freedom of expression from AI? So it might be that AI is doing things that are inconsistent with freedom of speech, like fraud and conspiracies and libel, and those aren't protected typically by a system of freedom of expression. How do we combat those things? That might be a populist movement, but then we need people who know a lot about AI to be engaged in the project of AI regulation. So a mixture of public values and technocratic expertise.
Do you think there could be a potential tension between the two? And I'm thinking having a lot of experts in the government and creating the impression that they are so detached from the people that it will actually kind of reduce a populist leaning toward liberalism.
Yeah, I lived it. I worked in the Biden administration uh, for 4 years, and I worked in the Obama administration for 4 years. So I lived that tension, particularly in my Obama administration position, where for environmental regulations, I lean technocrat, I'll say, in the sense that what are you going to do about air pollution from automobiles or air pollution from power plants or carcinogens? These are three sets of environmental problems. And the technocrats know a ton about what air pollutants are bad and what are the consequences of reducing them and which carcinogens are particularly potent and what form of regulation would save lives. And the populist forces often said carcinogen, three exclamation points, or particulate matter, three exclamation points. And that would lead to regulation. Hooray for that, I say. But it might lead to clueless regulation in the sense that it would be more aggressive than the facts warranted in some cases, and possibly less aggressive than the facts warranted in other cases. So there are, at least in my country, very vigorous disagreements between the technocrats and the populists. And at least if the disagreement is over some question of fact, that is something where you want people who know what they're doing to be playing a substantial role.
I guess if they disagree on how to address a reality that is common to both camps. It may be what we want in terms of disagreements. Now, it seems to me that one way to indeed inform the discussion might be to actually rely on technology. And I'm here thinking of a use of technology that will be, again, consistent with what Hayek highlighted in his Nobel speech on the pretence of knowledge, which to me is one of the most brilliant speeches ever given. The point that he makes in it is that even with all the best intention and the best knowledge in the world, it is hard for the government to design something that is optimum. And he was actually arguing for intelligently designed and continuously adjusted rules. I do wonder whether technology can play a role in gathering in decentralized information and, making sure that information actually reach the government as a way to escape the pretense of knowledge. Would you agree with that, or would you disagree?
Broadly, I agree. So that the government, let's suppose the government wants to regulate greenhouse gases, the government needs to know a lot about where greenhouse gases are coming from. So to use technology to get clarity on where greenhouse gases are coming from and the magnitude is a massive advance. There's a question of road safety in many nations. Technology can help us get clear on where road safety doesn't exist, and also potentially on what works in combating crashes. And so the fact that a lot of people are alive today who were involved in crashes is attributable to technology that makes the crashes less bad. And so technology to inform government is really important. I saw that every day.
Yeah. Now, of course, arguing against myself, I don't want to give the impression, and I think nor do you, that technology can solve it all, right? This would be tech solutionism. Every problem has a technical answer, which is not necessarily true. Although lawyers tend to engage in legal solutionism in a sense, right? Where any problem has a legal answer. And sometimes it may also be that combining the two or other constraints is a nice way to attain some results. I wonder about how this relates to your work on nudges and behavioral economics. Is that related, the use of technology to nudge people towards what's good for them?
So one thing that innovation does is to eliminate trade-offs. So it might be that people have a trade-off between their work and their home. Do they live near their work, or do they live in a place they'd much prefer? Now, it might be with technology, they can live where they want and use, let's say, their laptop to do their job, and they don't have to live in a place they don't want. Or it might be there's a trade-off between animal welfare, let's say, and what people want to eat, but it might be technology will produce things that don't involve the use of animals, so the trade-off is less searing. And if you look at technology all around us, it is eliminating or reducing terrible trade-offs. For some problems, I have a friend who has a minor heart issue, and she has to monitor how her heart's doing. And she has on the cell phone something that tells her whenever she wants about relevant things involving her heart and whether she's having a problem. Reduces a problem, which is a lack of information that she has and her doctor has on how she's doing. And for many health things, so technological solutionism is sometimes foolish and sometimes fantastic and true. We need to think of the specific. I can drive from where I am right now to New York in approximately 4 hours. For my great-grandparents, that would have been a completely unrealistic idea. And, I can talk to friends who are in other countries or acquaintances who are doing podcasts in other countries. That was not a thing until startlingly recently in human history. We didn't know about toxic releases in the United States. We now do. And that's partly because of technological advances that just make this doable. So whether we have a technological solution to a thing depends on concreteness. And we might well think of diseases where people would die in the blink of an eye in terms of human history, and now they're not dying. And the reason is technology. So there's that. On nudges, GPS device, speaking of technology, that's kind of an iconic nudge where you get in your car and I don't know if you remember, I remember the time when to drive from one place to an unfamiliar place was horrible. And get someone to write a little map and maybe they make a mistake and you find yourself lost. GPS device is a nudge and it's a great nudge. It's freedom preserving in two ways. First, you decide where your destination is, and nudges put the chooser in the driver's seat, literally in this case, but in other cases, metaphorically. And also, you can reject the route that the GPS device suggests. You don't have to take it. So it's freedom preserving in that sense, but it steers you, it nudges you to adopt the route that will get you where you want to go. And nudges typically have that feature. Now, if you go to the grocery store and it says this product has shellfish and you are being nudged, if you have a shellfish allergy, not to eat it, or if it says here's the calories, lots and lots of calories, as some nations require, then you are being nudged. But it's up to you if you want the brownies because they're delicious, lots of calories. My car has a lane departure warning. So if I'm going from one lane to another, it makes a little noise. That saves lives, actually, lane departure warnings. And that's a nudge. Of course, you can go from one lane to another. It's not stopping you, but it's nudging you actually to pay attention. And if you're about to crash into something or you're getting really close, many cars these days will make a warning sign and it'll be very visible. And that's a nudge. If you want to crash into the thing, car isn't going to stop you, at least not yet, but you're being nudged. Nudges, I've given some technological examples and also some that aren't, like a label or a warning, or if you're automatically enrolled, let's say once you take a job, you're automatically enrolled in a healthcare plan or a savings plan. If you don't like it, you can opt out. If so, it's a nudge. If you're forced in it, then it's not a nudge, it's a mandate.
For those of you who have lived in the world with the iPhone and other GPS technology, before that, the location you wanted to reach when we used to have maps on paper will always be in between the two pages, right? This will be a rule. So you will always struggle to reach the location.
Yeah,
now,
fair.
if I understand, so you are saying that technology, and I never thought of it this way, as a way to resolve trade-offs and tensions, can actually be a way so that the nudge is not necessary anymore because the tension disappeared, or it could be, depending, of course, on the nature of the nudge and the issue you are trying to solve, a way for the nudge to become more effective. Is that right?
Completely. And it needn't be technological. So if you are told at your workplace that don't go there because there's unhealthy fumes there, now it might be you're not blocked, maybe your job requires you, but you're being nudged to do it as little as possible. That's not technology. But absolutely. And I love your first point, which is that a very difficult trade-off, innovation every day makes disappear or makes no longer difficult.
Yeah. All right. I want to conclude talking about you and your own thinking. You've worked in governments, Obama, Biden administration. You've written on behavioral economics, constitutional law, now this defense of liberalism. How has your thinking about liberalism evolved over your career? And if it has evolved, do you think that any of those experiences that I just mentioned played a more important role in that evolution?
Thank you for that. I started my career at the University of Chicago, and I had an adversarial relationship, admiring but adversarial relationship to what makes the Chicago School the Chicago School. So the free market enthusiasm of Friedman and Hayek and Becker and Stigler, I learned a lot from, but I was in some process of contestation, maybe young rebel law professor, seeing these giants and thinking, well, maybe you're wrong. And here's why. I was very excited about that. I now am part of team free market, not in the sense that I don't agree with what I said before, probably more agree with what I said before than disagree, but that I have much more enthusiasm and appreciation for Hayek and the Austrian school than I did. So the claims of Hayek and von Mises about the knowledge problem faced by government actors, I see as really fundamental and basically true. I used to think it was important, but not fundamental, I guess. And I thought that it was way overstated. I do think that in some forms it's overstated, too abstract, but I'm for it now. It makes me smile rather than grimace. I think what my kind of late increase in enthusiasm for, I've always admired Hayek. How can you not admire Hayek? But my increase in admiration for Hayek is fueled by less my own government experience, where of course I did see the knowledge problem occasionally and thought Hayekian insights were very important as a way of increasing humility in terms of actual practice. And I can give you some examples, if you like, where Hayek was foremost in my mind, but also seeing the world today, where some of Hayek's concerns in the 40s, at least, are more with us than they were, let's say, 10 or 15 years ago.
You do say in the book at some point that disagreeing with Hayek is always a dangerous endeavor. And I thought this was quite well put. Indeed, could you maybe to ask the very final question, give us that one example of where Hayek played a role? And I guess to be fair to you, because you do say you prefer Mill to Hayek, where does it come in the mix?
Okay, so there's a regulation of fuel economy in the United States. And some form of this is almost certainly a good idea because of externalities from air pollution. And there's about energy self-sufficiency, and there are reasons to do this, I think. We issued a rule that had a long time horizon. And I thought that doesn't make any sense because we know too little. It may be that the fuel economy that we think is justified X years hence, that will be way wrong, that the situation in terms of technology will be much more stopped and less aggressive than we expect, or it might be more aggressive than we expect. There might be more innovation than we expect. We don't know. How can we project what cars should be like in 10 years? So I was part of a group of people who said we need to have a period in the middle where we stop and think, how are things looking now, and reassess. Now, was that enough to justify what we did in the first place? People can dispute that, but better to have a pause period where you think, what's the market looking like now? And I would favor frequent pause periods. That was a Hayekian thing. More broadly, under President Obama, we had a look back at our regulations where we were reassessing the ones on the books to see if they made any sense. And that was a Hayekian thought about the knowledge problem that government faces in the first place. In terms of Mill and Hayek is a little cold and Mill is very warm. When Mill talks about Harriet Taylor, you got to love him and her. When Hayek talks about Harriet Taylor, I think, Hayek, you fell in love at least once. Why do you not get Mill and Taylor? And so the warmth of Mill is what draws me to him more than Hayek. I love Hayek, but he, at least in writing, let's just say he's not quite as relatable. In terms of what they actually have to say, Hayek was narrower, but he was very deep in the domain in which he lived, which was really the knowledge problem over and over and over again. Mill was wider. So Mill had a conception of humanity and its promise that was not adequately captured by the epistemic problem that outsiders have, though he was all over that. He was also defending liberty on romantic grounds about self-development and learning, not just that outsiders don't know enough. And I want to convince you to love Mill as much as Hayek, if not more than Hayek, because of sheer human breadth. He was a little like Shakespeare, and you couldn't say that about Hayek.
I think I've watched all the videos of Hayek that are available on YouTube, and there's quite a lot. And he is cold. Even it appears to be cold even in person. So here is what I would advise anyone listening to us. First, read your book, because it is rather short. It's 150 pages. It is very deep. it gives you such a good perspective as to what is liberalism today, where it comes from, what it can be tomorrow, what we can achieve from it. And then indeed engage with Hayek, with Mill, and many others that you explore in the book. And this, I'm not sure if that's a good thing, but while reading the book, I took so many notes as to which other books I should read. And my fear now is not having the time, but I guess having them in the library is already a positive feature. So on that, I think it's a good place for us to stop the conversation. Again, thank you so very much for that book and everything you've written over your career so far. I am always looking forward to what you publish. You are, if I may say, one of the only few people that every time I see a new publication coming from you, I know I'm going to print that and read it. So thank you for everything and all those years of knowledge. And to everyone out there, take care of yourself. And if you can, someone else too. Bye-bye.
Great honor. Thank you.